Yeah, there was a number of unknowns for me. I didn't know whether, and that I think a number of unknowns for my parents around. I never really questioned them. We never really had that discussion about, what does end of life look like. As my parents as my parents got into their 80s, we never had that discussion. Because I grew up in a generation where, there were certain things you just didn't talk about. You didn't talk about how much mom and dad made. You didn't talk about, there were certain things. And know what, our family was separated somewhat from, my mom and dad were closer to my brother and sister who lived in the area, and I was in Toronto. Not really an outlier, but it was just something that we didn't really talk about, but I knew that my parents' spiritual journey was very strong, and their connection with the church was very strong. I know when my dad passed, I had a conversation with one of my mom's cousins who lives in Toronto, and as part of that conversation, my mom's cousin said, "Oh yeah, when we were younger, all the cousins looked up to your mom and dad." And that in terms of being role models. So it was, and part of that was, back in those days, it was, church was a lot more central to people's lives, I think, than it is today. And so I know mom and dad had conversations they were very close to their church community in Perth. Reverend Jerry Kerr, he was a good friend of my dad's. And I'm sure that they had those conversations.
Well, I will admit there's a bit of self-interest in this in some ways, because I'm 63, so I'm at the beginning of my elder years, hopefully. It's true. As we joke in my family, because all my aunts and uncles are dead now, my parents are dead, so we're in the front line. My generation's in the front line. What I learned about death and dying. Well, I don't fear death anymore. I started that experience when my father-in-law died 31 years ago, and I was at his bedside, and then when my father died. So I really see the mystery and the beauty of the dying process, what it can be. I'm a Celtic person, and Celts have a particular view on death as being near and not particularly frightening. It's all around us, so I guess that's part of it. But I just saw what amazing things can happen when you're part of someone dying, or someone aging. And to me, it sort of said, what's it all about, right? It's not buying more crap, It's not going on more holidays. It's not generating more carbon emissions. It's about interactions, humans connecting, birth, death, marriage. There aren't many more. There are a few very big moments, right? And death is one of the big moments. So for me, I wanted to be part of that. I didn't want to shy away. Oh my God, I can't deal with this. Well, I could deal with it, even though it was painful and sad at times. But it wasn't always painful and sad. We had fun times when my mom was dying. We had laughs and stuff like that. She did goofy things sometimes. We did goofy things. So I learned that through that process, you really have to focus on where you are now, and you really have to cut through there's so much crap out there. There's so much crap. And so, I guess to summarize, my mother really had a beautiful death. She died in a state of acceptance and gratitude and awe. And that's an awesome thing to say. And I don't use the word awesome that much, because I only use it when something is filling me with awe. It was beautiful. And she gave back so much, as she was dying. And it's not something to be afraid of. It wasn't a burden to me, in her case. I just thought it was just a beautiful mystery, and I want it to stay a mystery, It was just unbelievable what I've seen with my mother, my father-in-law, and uncle, and I carried it right through. Like, I wrote my mom's funeral service, I gave her eulogy, I helped dig her grave, and I spoke at her graveside funeral. and I helped bury her with my cousins and my brothers and sisters. So my view on death and dying is get right involved. I was like, I'm walking towards that fire. I'm not shirking or recoiling. I'm like, no, get involved. Yeah, be there for her. Because to me, that was part of the service thing too. Seeing my mother, and this is a bit of a Celtic thing, seeing my mother being in her company until she's buried. Her ashes were buried.
Yeah, I realize that they people in there often can't speak for themselves, or they're dismissed. So you need to be their eyes and ears and mouth.
Um, so I also wanted to change tacks a little bit and talk about death and dying, and in particular, um, yeah, um, both from a sort of like spiritual dimension, but also from a practical dimension. Um, what happens when we die?
What happens to we die? I think we become one with all things.
Sorry, I meant from a practical
From
perspective.
a practical. What happens when we die? I won't.
Sorry.
You can cut that out. In a nursing home, apparently my mother, when she passed, she had a fall. Apparently, they found her on the floor around 6 a.m. They didn't contact me till 4.
PM?
And that was a day when I go bowling. That's a Sunday when I go bowling, and they called me. I was actually on the Don Valley Parkway with my partner and our good friend, and heading home, because he always comes home with us on Sundays. And I got the call saying, you need to come in. Your mother's dying. And I was shocked. I had heard nothing. So I said, well, I'm just coming down the parkway. I'll be there as soon as I can. So I got there, and she was in her bed. They had called EMT. They were wondering if they should take her to Emerge, but then realized that she was going anyways. So that it did make sense to send her to Emerge, where she'd be probably poked and prodded, and with a bunch of people around her that didn't know her. At least she was in the home that she had lived in for the past 5 years, and she was with people that knew her. So I agreed to leave her there, and the EMT stayed for a while, and I stayed with her, and then they decided, I think they knew, they said it was moments away, and they left me alone with her. And I just sat there and talked to her. I even talked to her about how difficult her relationship had been, how I wished I could have been there for her more, but I just couldn't. I had to always have a boundary up, because I never knew. And then they came back and they listened to her and said she was gone. And it wasn't a moment of great grief. There was some kind of relief, knowing that I wouldn't have to struggle with this anymore, and that she wouldn't have to worry about her future, because she was her mind was starting to go. She was getting confused.
So I always say to people who have a relative dying that to get involved, right? It's going to be painful. It's going to be sad. It's going to be messy. It's going to be complicated. But you only have one shot, Like I only have one mother, I only have one father. And I was able to be with him somewhat before he died, which was great. I was at my father-in-law's bedside when he died. My wife only had 24 hours with her father before he died, So I make the most of it, So with my mother, I wasn't going to miss that. I had one shot, to be with my mother and to help my mother, to serve her, and I was not going to miss that. No way. There was no way I was going to miss that, because that made me a better person. It was such an incredible experience, and I would not have missed that for the world. So it was. I'm thankful to her. I'm grateful to her that she allowed me to be of service to her. She allowed me to be a helper, to comfort her. to be her power of attorney, to be her helper. She allowed me. That was her decision, to do that. And she welcomed me in. It was great. It was beautiful. And I would say I would never have missed that for the world. No way. No way.